is Wafa Halam for Inside Arabia. I'm very happy to welcome CJ Werleman to a conversation on Zoom from across the oceans. CJ Werleman is a journalist, a published author, a commentator, an analyst of conflict and terrorism, and an activist who has dedicated his career to exposing discrimination and injustice against Muslim communities around the world. CJ, welcome to our chat. I'm really happy to have you. This is really so nice. I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks, Wafa. Looking forward to the conversation. This is great.
I am actually talking to you about a situation that very few people are aware of, and I confess even myself for a long time was not quite understanding what the meaning of it was. We all know what Islamophobia is, which is basically fear of Islam and Muslim people. But you have actually clarified for me to a large extent. You wrote when you piece all strength of the UAE foreign policy together, what you have is a Muslim-led country standing in firm opposition to Muslims who seek freedom from occupation, discrimination, and persecution. In other words, the UAE and other countries, probably Saudi Arabia and others that I can think of, hold that political Islamic movements are a threat. And therefore, they equate them with the notion of them being extremists and terrorists. And what they do is push that narrative, that understanding to Western countries. And in so doing, obviously, they are feeding into the fear of Islam as being the problem, or political people who hold political views based on Islam. And they don't see them, let's say, just as you would say, Christian Democrats in Europe, or Christian parties or groups all over the West. But when it comes to Islam, there is that discrimination that if you are talking on behalf of Islam, or that, then you must be a terrorist. So how a Muslim majority country can be Islamophobic is my question. And isn't that a bit of a contradiction in term? And what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I guess naturally, it does sound contradictory to accuse any Muslim of being Islamophobic, as I guess it's somewhat difficult to be, afraid of yourself. Although I can terrify myself when I'm around sharp objects or heavy machinery. That said, when I talk about a Muslim majority country being Islamophobic, I guess what I'm saying is the government of that country is using Islamophobia or weaponizing Islamophobia to advance its strategic or geopolitical interests. Now, and I guess this is, a rudimentary international relations stuff, but, regimes, whether they be democratic or authoritarian, they really only care about one thing, and that is the survival of the regime itself. In fact, our entire international system is built on the understanding that, 194 countries or 200 countries in the world, these regimes these governments of these countries will do whatever it takes to survive, whether that's good or bad, in order to survive an election, to survive the next election, or crush down a popular revolt or a coup or a foreign invasion, or whatever. So we now, I guess, we're in this strange place where Saudi Arabia, the self-anointed protectors of Islam, and the United Arab Emirates, now count among the world's largest benefactors of Islamophobia. And then, as you pointed out just then in your intro, these countries, or the governments of these countries, have forged alliances with far-right groups and political parties that are mobilized by anti-Muslim bigotry. We've seen this in parties in Italy, and parties in Sweden, and also the United States. The UAE and Saudi Arabia are, two of the biggest sources of income for think tanks in the United States. And obviously, they don't just fund these think tanks for the good of academic inquiry. They do so to also help advance their own agendas or their own interests. And what we've seen in the last few years is these countries align themselves with individuals which have been long associated with the Islamophobia industry or the counter-jihad movement, individuals like Frank Gaffney and David Horowitz and the likes, Seb Gorka, who was a foreign policy advisor for Donald Trump. And they see these groups as convenient because these groups also push a very pro-Israel agenda. And pushing a pro-Israel agenda, they're therefore going to be pushing policies which are very hostile towards Iran, which has become their arch nemesis and the only thing that they've become largely obsessed about in recent times.
I guess this is that explains it a little bit. The survival of the regime, the survival of the government, of their regimes is really what is the motivator behind pushing the Islamophobic feelings in the West and in the region as well, not just in the West. How did they do this within the region, within the larger MENA region in particular? I mean, what actions do they actually take in a material way to try and defeat those political Islamic movements?
Yeah, I mean, they've latched onto U.S. war on terror discourse. And US war on terror discourse, at the root of that is linking Islam to terrorism, Islam being a gateway to violent extremism. And so by linking Islam to terrorism, it becomes a catch-all to root out and associate any conservative Muslim, politically active, or any political activists who express their political activism or opposition to the regime through Islamic banners and Islamic slogans or Islamic scripture. And so by tying Islam to terrorism, they can crack down on dissidents at home and in a way that becomes sympathetic to Western ears. If the Western governments are waging a war against terrorism, which has become an excuse to wage a war against Islam, then who are we to condemn these governments if they're carrying out the same kind of actions and policies at home?
And we seem to see also a lot of actually worse than just the propaganda war, more than just, say, pushing a narrative and trying to change minds. They actually use military power. They use forces. They use militias. They try to do more than just. It is much more and much more severe, obviously. I would like you to address the situation that we know of in Yemen and Libya and Egypt. Started obviously in Egypt after the coup against Morsi, the democratically elected president. Can you please go a little bit in more detail in terms of what action and how much power they're putting behind those counter-revolutionary actions?
Yeah, I mean, these regimes are still deeply traumatized by the events of the Arab Spring. They watched on in horror as Mubarak's military junta was overthrown by a popular revolt when Egyptians rose up in the streets and forcing Mubarak to leave power or to rescind power and pave the way for democratic free elections. And in that political space, the Muslim Brotherhood was popularly elected by the Egyptian people. And that's mostly because, it's the vestige of, or the legacy of, European colonialism in this country. European colonial powers absolutely ripped apart all levels of political and civic life in these countries. And they did that so there wouldn't be any challenge to their colonial exploits. So the only organized body at the grassroots level, rather, is religion. And so politics gets channeled through religion, and therefore the Muslim Brotherhood came to power. They also watched on what happened to the Assad regime in Syria. I mean, millions of Syrians marching in the streets, initially demanding modest democratic and political and economic reforms, and that turned into Assad making a choice: either hear the people out or kill the people. And he chose to kill the people, and now that country is ripped apart, destroyed, bankrupt, and left to the control of foreign powers like Russia and Iran. Now, this is a future that the government in Abu Dhabi and the Saudi government in Riyadh, is doing its utmost to prevent doesn't happen to them. So they're pursuing a very aggressive foreign policy. As you mentioned, this bombing campaign now is 6 years old in Yemen, which has now become the world's largest humanitarian crisis. UAE warplanes and Saudi warplanes still bomb civilian targets in that country. And we have also in Libya, the UAE is supporting one of the most violent militias, if not the most violent militia in all of Africa. This is a militia led by General Haftar, who is killing Libyans, pro-democracy Libyans, anti-dictator Libyans, and the Libyans who rose up against ISIS. We just saw a human rights activist in Libya murdered in the streets a couple of days ago by members of Haftar's regime. So by tying Islam to terrorism and promoting and fostering sympathy through far-right political groups around the world, they're able to create this space where they're able to pursue in a very aggressive and a very foreign policy in these countries.
And they're putting tons of money and effort to actually backing those counter-revolutionary forces in Libya. In Yemen, forget it. I think it cost something in the hundreds of billions of dollars to the Saudis and the Emiratis. And they have not succeeded in anything except actually, creating this horrendous humanitarian crisis, but also really one seems to see no end in sight. Most analysts and most observers are so completely baffled and don't see the light at the end of the tunnel in any of those situations. Do you have any kind of understanding, or can you imagine some ways out of this quagmire in those countries, both Libya and Yemen?
Yeah, well, I guess Yemen first. We're a few days into president, since Biden became president-elect in the recent U.S. elections, and we know for a fact that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are apoplectic about the result there. They were desperately hoping Donald Trump would be elected and that they would have a continuation of this total carte blanche, green light foreign policy that they've enjoyed under this, the Trump administration, to pursue whatever means that they want in the Middle East uninterrupted. We have to remember that Trump, the US Congress never ever passes a bipartisan bill anymore, and it's almost non-existent. But one of the only times that both political parties in the United States came together was to pass a bill to end the US involvement in the Saudi-led war in Yemen, and Trump vetoed that bill, and not only vetoed that bill, but going to continue the flood of the tranche of weapons traveling to that part of the world. In fact, yesterday we know that billions more arms are being transferred to the UAE, including dozens of new drones and also 50 F-35 fighter jets, the most advanced fighter warplane in the world. So the only hope, I guess, is Biden on the campaign trail has promised. One of his first immediate actions is to end U.S. war in Yemen, the U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen, which is kind of ironic given it was he was part of the administration which green-lighted that military campaign in the first place. But he has promised to do that, and it's just a fact that Saudi Arabia and UAE cannot continue what they're doing in Yemen without U.S. Logistical and aerial support. They just can't find targets, hit targets, and they can't even, fix and put in their own, spare parts for their fighter planes. So I would think the end is approaching. Is near.
Is it conceivable to think that maybe Israel could be taking a role in Yemen now that they are so, exchanging technology and security apparatus and arms, with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and doing it now openly? Is it imaginable that they would actually provide some kind of support if the United States chooses to withdraw from that conflict?
That question may be a little bit above my pay grade, but That would be hard to imagine. Israel is very hesitant to, it loves building its military capacity to project beyond its borders, but it doesn't like to use it unless
Well, it's been using it in Syria.
Yeah, but with limited strikes against very specific military targets, and also, I mean, in southern Lebanon, it's it carries out missile strikes against Hezbollah targets from time to time. But to involve itself that far from, I mean, these are strikes which are happening right on their borders, very close to the Golan Heights and very close to its border with Lebanon. It's hard to imagine Israel would be game enough to carry out a military operation in the Middle East that far from its border.
At least not openly.
Yeah, at least not openly, exactly.
They're very good at secretive action. This leads me to go back to the concept of Islamophobia propagated by an Islamic country. The action that what we see happen, for instance, just recently in France, with the cartoons by depicting the Prophet and raging again, population around the Islamic and Muslim world, and the reaction, the official reactions of those countries that have been pushing this Islamophobia in the West, actually arguing, and trying to shame France for taking certain action against them. What do you think about that? Can you explain what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, what I find just astounding is this whole, France's crackdown on Muslims and Islam, which is purely, Macron's a political ploy by Macron to outflank his nearest political challenger, that being Marine Le Pen from the National Rally Party. It's almost a race to see who can express the most hatred of Muslims. And if he can do that, then he can counter a challenge to his presidency. That said, what is baffling is only 2 countries really have come out in support of Macron's crackdown on Muslims. One being China. In fact, China praised Macron. At the same time, it basically sold its concentration camps a solution for France's, 6 or 8 million Muslim minority. And the United Arab Emirates. In fact, yesterday, the UAE foreign minister praised Macron, saying he's absolutely right for cracking down on Muslims in France, which tells you everything you need to know about where the UAE is when it comes to, restive or pesky Muslim minorities. It's just, it's astonishing.
And how far it's willing to go. This leads me to ask you, what does the popular Arabs and Muslim population think of all this? I mean, are they even aware of it? And is there any kind of support for all this normalization deals with Israel, with the standing for what Macron is doing in France? And is there any kind of popular support in their own countries, in the UAE and Saudi Arabia?
No, I mean, not from the people. I mean, we have to be very clear, these normalization deals, for instance, with Israel, this is, and, whether it's Sudan or UAE or Bahrain or whatever, these are purely the deals are done through, the policymakers and the regimes themselves. But the people in the streets are vehemently opposed to these deals. I think there was a poll taken with Bahrainians, and it was something like 88 or 90% of Bahrainians absolutely and fully condemn the normalization of the apartheid Israeli regime. So the support isn't there, but
but then you don't care about the people anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, these are not democracies. They don't rule by the will of the people. They rule and govern purely based on what is in the interests of the ruling elites, and that's it. Right.
It's extraordinary how it seems just, at the beginning of the Arab Spring, which let's say about 10 years ago, we never really seemed to hear much about, the interventions by the Gulf countries and, the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And it seems that that was the starting point that the fear of this sprawling revolutionary wave that went throughout the MENA region is really what ignited this whole thing, because originally Saudi Arabia was the one building all those mosques and Islamic schools throughout the Muslim world, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in India, in all those places, and pushing their narrative, which is a very strict interpretation and very conservative and very stern interpretation of Islam, the Wahhabism and the Salafist movements, and therefore, in fact, if we all recall that the 9/11 people were all originally from Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Therefore, really, they were fed from that culture. So it's interesting to see this turnaround. Do you think that the Saudis have now stopped this push towards more Islamic Wahhabist thought throughout the Islamic world, or is that something that is going on still?
I mean, that's a really good question, and as obvious as your question is, and your observation, I actually hadn't really thought about how that has at least consciously, how that has come full circle. We've in response to the Russian Afghanistan, or the Soviet Afghanistan, in the 1980s, you had Saudi Arabia, as you pointed out, setting up madrasas and Islamic schools all throughout Asia and Central Asia, Africa, and the likes, and also in Europe, which was to and these schools sell a very an extremist or literal interpretation of Islam.
I can call it extremist. It's extremist.
yeah, okay. And now we have a situation, because that suited Saudi Arabia's geopolitical or its grand strategy at that point in time. But now we've I guess where it's the conflict is, well, it's Cold War with Iran, if you like. Now they're funding far right anti-Muslim bigots around the world. So somebody needs to write a think piece on this.
That's right. So, how about you?
I don't think I'm smart enough. But
Yeah. The last thing I want to ask you, CJ, is really about what's the situation in India, Kashmir, in China, and how those horrendous situations and Islamophobic oppression of Muslims in those countries, with the Uyghurs in China and in Kashmir, and you are an expert on that. Could you please explain a little bit and enlighten us a little bit about what the United Arab Emirates in particular is doing to turn a blind eye, not only to turn a blind eye, but almost encourage the perpetrators?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it comes back to my, one of my original points in our discussion, that, regimes don't do what's morally or ethically right. They do what suits their, the interests of the regime at that point in time. And what suits the interests of United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and actually a half dozen other Arab Gulf countries, is its relationship with India and China. Two of the, these are the growth, the economic growth engines of the world going forward. So it does not suit, if you're a ruler in Abu Dhabi or a ruler in Riyadh, it doesn't suit to condemn or risk economic punitive retaliation from Beijing or New Delhi. And therefore, at the same time that they boast about being defenders of Islam and Muslims, they're encouraging and supporting, I mean, not just privately, but publicly. I mean, what is happening in Xinjiang in northwestern China is genocide. It's not just cultural genocide, it's genocide. We know in some Uyghur villages in that part of, in that region, up to 80% of the Uyghur population has disappeared, either into the network of concentration camps or forcibly disappeared altogether. Now, the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Oman and Bahrain and Iraq and the Assad regime all wrote a letter to the United Nations supporting what Beijing is doing there, saying that it's necessary for counterterrorism and counter-separatism measures. And I mean, and likewise, what India is doing in Kashmir at the moment is basically the equivalent of what Israel has been doing in the Palestinian territory since 1967. It's where that was a Jewish settler colonial project. India has launched a Hindu settler colonial project last year when it abrogated Article 370 of its constitution, paving the way for military outposts to be turned into Hindu settlements, and settlements into Hindu towns and cities in their own right. And the UAE praised Narendra Modi for saying this would bring peace and stability to Kashmir. We're talking about 8 million Muslims are at the risk of being ethnically cleansed in that territory. So, these regimes don't give a damn about the plight of Muslims around the world. They only care about further enriching themselves through oil and gas deals with the governments of China and India.
And Western powers have not really been very vocal either. I mean, the UN is pretty much a lame organizations. They don't represent anything. The European Union is missing in action most of the time. A lot of talks, but no action whatsoever. And obviously, the US has been also missing from the mix. That this is all very depressing.
Well, one of the great ironies is countries which are long associated with anti-Muslim animus are the ones who are most vocal against what China and India are doing against these Muslim people, whereas Muslim majority countries are actually the opposite. They're the ones who are supporting these genocide and ethnic cleansing.
I know that you're outraged and really horrified by what's happening and feel very helpless, and I commend you for the work you do, and I thank you very much for continuing to shed light and just tell the stories of the people who are voiceless. And I thank you very much for your time, CJ. This has been wonderful.
Oh, thanks so much, Wafra. And I really appreciate it. You having me on the program, and I'm very proud to be associated with Inside Arabia. You guys are doing fantastic work, and it's a fantastic magazine, and this has been a great thrill.